Hey everyone, Andre from CFX Films here, and in this video we're going to be covering how to properly set up your Xbox controller input inside of Unity 3D. Now there are some pictures that I've seen online of people listing what buttons actually map to where on the controller, but it's one thing to have just the image and it's another thing to actually have an actual scripted example of how the buttons actually interact in Unity and receive that data. So I created this sample scene that actually uses every button on the controller, and we're going to try and program each one of those buttons. So if you see in my scene right now, I have this text here. I just basically set up a blank scene. Nothing is controlled yet, but you have the left stick, the right stick, and you have all the other buttons and triggers that are on the controller. And on the main camera, I just have a simple controller script that I just generated, and it's actually blank. See, so we're going to be adding something in there very soon. All that you're going to need to do is basically just program the input manager to talk to the buttons on the controller. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to be having the colors of these white objects in the scene changing to red or black. Actually, it'll probably just be black and white, but you'll see how that happens, and it's actually a lot of fun. So we're just going to open up the script and get started. All right. So I already removed the start and update functions. I believe by default those are there, but we don't need those. So the first thing we're going to want to do is create all the variables that we'll need. We'll need triggers. Now, these are just renderers, so this is just how we're going to be controlling the color. As you're pressing the trigger, we're going to be able to track how much the trigger is being pressed, since it's a value from 0 to 1. And we're going to represent that using a float number. And because of that, it allows you to actually visually see the trigger being pressed without you actually seeing the trigger. And that value can be used in any way. You know, calculating the acceleration, braking a car, aiming down a gun. You know, there's so many different things that you can use for that, as you've seen in games. And we're just going to have a very, very basic example of that you can then copy and paste and tweak however you want in your projects. We need bumpers. Now these are just the boxes that I have in the scene already that you saw. Buttons. The D-pad. And we have one for each of the D-pad buttons so that we can properly display, you know, where you're actually pressing on the D-pad. So the start and back buttons. And arguably the most fun of the controller, the joysticks. We'll have a cube for the left stick and a cube for the right stick. And then, of course, how fast do we want it to actually move just in our test scene. All right, and that's actually all we're going to need for variables. That is every button on the controller. So we'll now actually get to the fun part, which is the actual code implementation. So we're just going to set a simple update here. Now we're going to define all of the variables that we'll need. Now, these are actually the input manager names. These can be whatever you want, but for our purposes, I'm going to keep it consistent with my naming conventions and how I have them organized. But you can change these later if you really want to, because again, this is just a string value. Now, bumpers and buttons are basically bool values because the controller is only detecting is it pressed or is it not. Technically, it's 0 and 1, but it's really easy to just track it with a, am I pressing the button or am I not pressing the button? On your keyboard, you can't halfway press the spacebar down. It's either down or it's up. So that's why we're going to use a bool value. Now the back button. Now I don't want to type this all again, so I'll just that didn't go very well. There you go. And we'll make this B, X, Y, and then over here, same thing. Y, X, B. Awesome. And now we need the D-pad values. The D-pad is indeed an axis. It's not actually a button. That is not common knowledge there. So you'd think it's actually pressing a left, up, right, and down, but it's actually detecting it as an axis, since it's it is actually on an axis when you're bending the buttons. So that's how the values are read. We're multiplying this by our movement speed. Okay, cool. Let me zoom in just a little bit in case it's hard to read this at all. Only a few more here. All right, great. That's everything. Now, I do want to point out something. This is mouse X. Even though we're using a joystick for this, Unity can have multiple inputs all with the same name, and it'll just check for any of them. So that's why we have horizontal and vertical for the keyboard and for joystick movements. And Unity has that by default. We can also do that for mouse X and mouse Y if we need to. Yeah, so Unity is actually pretty smart about that. So that's an advantage. Masu, that's an advantage to having using multiple names with the same input names. All right. The colors. We're going to make it a new color, and the color value from 0 to 1 is going to be set to how much we're actually pressing the trigger down. So it's going to be our trigger float for all 3 channels. And we're going to do the same thing for the left trigger. Now, by the way, this is Visual Studio Code that I'm running here. That's why you might not recognize it exactly. So it might look like something a little different than Visual Studio or the default editor that you're using, maybe MonoDevelop. This one gives you a lot of really cool, helpful tips in the code and suggestions, and sort of, when you have one name, something highlighted, it tells you where all of them are. and then you can edit them all at the same time. That's just one of many features that it has. I highly recommend you use it because it's free and it's super powerful. I have several friends at AAA studios that actually use this over Visual Studio. So, you know, that speaks for itself. All right, so D-pad settings. This is just going to be, this might be a little clunky, but basically what we're trying to do here is we're just trying to detect if the button is pressed on the axis, it will light up the button, and if it's not, it will just return it back to its normal color. If it's less than 0, then we are going to set D-pad left, the color, we're going to set that to white, and then we're going to set the right one to black. And we're going to do an else if you are pressing the right one. So if it's greater than 0, then you must be. I'm actually just going to reverse these. So I'm going to copy and paste it, and then we're going to set it to that. D-pad left is going to be 0. And then if you are not pressing any of them, then we're just going to set them both to 0. Okay, we're going to copy and paste this for the vertical settings. And now we're going to set this to vertical. And then it's going to be D-pad down instead of left. So then left, left, and then this is going to be up for right. All right, great. Now the bumpers. If left bumper, then left bumper box dot material dot color. It's the same thing. Equals new. It's going to be white. Else, if we're not pressing the bumper, then we're just going to set this to black. Okay. Do the same thing for the right bumper. And that should be it for that. A, B, X, and Y buttons. So if we're pressing the A button, we are going to set A button sphere, material color to new color to white. Else, if not pressing A button, then just change it to black. Very simple. I know it's a lot of lines of code, but it is actually quite simple. And we're just going to copy and paste this for the B button. And then X. And then Y. Now back in start buttons. So if back button, there you go, if back button's being pressed, back box, material color equals new color 1, or if not pressing back button. So you see how this is, you know, we're just doing the same thing, very, very simple. So you're probably getting into the groove of this now if you're following along with what I'm doing, trying to make this as simple as possible. If you're pressing the start button, then it's start box instead, and that's it. Now, the only thing left is we have to handle the movement in per second measurements, which basically means instead of moving everything by a frame, so the movement speed right now is just a float value. So if we don't tell it to actually move according to a time scale in Unity, when we're moving the joystick, it's going to be moving, you know, what did we set the speed at? To 2. So it's 2 meters per frame, which is insane. So we're going to do instead move H and multiply that by time delta time. So now that value is now multiplied by time instead of just, meters, unity meters. And we're going to do this for move vertical, and then we're going to do the right stick. So this is left stick, and then this is right stick. I should just call this L, actually. Let's keep it simple. Where is it? There it is. There we go. A little easier to track. And all we have to do is moving the boxes. So we're going to translate with the move vertical value, and then the move horizontal value would be L, and then cube RS translate with move VR, and then move HR. Now, yeah, I forgot we got to put forgot it's not a vector 3. We have to set the 0 value so they're not moving vertically at all. And I believe that is everything we need to make this happen. So we're going to minimize the script here, go back into our scene. Now I have auto refresh off, so I'm going to press Control R, and this is what will happen for you. So we're waiting for everything to show up and load, and all right, there we go. We got all our variables. So let's now fill them in. So right trigger, got left trigger, left bumper, right bumper, our buttons, the D-pad boxes, the start box, the back box, and the left stick and right stick. All right, very cool. So I already have all my inputs made, so it will work for me, but I'm not going to press play yet, and I'm going to try and set this up for you. So we're going to go Edit, Project Settings, and then we're going to go to Input. And now this is what you're going to have. You're going to have a bunch of different axes here, and you're not going to have the new ones that I added, and I actually deleted a few too. So we're going to go through and actually set up the ones that you're going to need. Now, most of the settings will remain to their default values with only a few adjustments needing anything at all, because Unity kind of has a lot of default values that are actually already set properly and you don't really have to change them. So I'm going to assume that you are familiar with the basic input settings in Unity, so I won't go over every option for the inputs. If you are brand new to that, you can pause this video and go to in the description where I have the link to Unity's documentation on what these values actually mean. Gravity, dead, sensitivity, snap, invert. So I'm just going to be using a few of these values, but I assume that you already know what they are. So let's jump in. So the first thing we're going to do is a left stick. So Unity by default already has their second horizontal and vertical values, and this is what we're going to use. They have the same names, no need to change that, but in vertical settings you have to disable invert. I believe by default it is actually checked on, and that will just have everything, it's basically inverted flight controls. That's all that is. And joystick settings are already set, the joystick axis, which is what we're going to be using for the other ones. Make sure the sensitivity is set to 1, and the dead value by default is what's pretty good that I found works best for Xbox One controller is about 0.19. That's about a good dead zone. If you let go of the joystick, there's that leeway between the joystick returning back to its default position, which is 0, and if it gets below this value, it'll actually just not read any of the input, which is really helpful so you don't have random little incremental movements. Most games use this, and by most games I mean all games that have controller settings actually use this feature. So that's left stick. Right stick, we're going to go to mouse X and Y, and you're going to duplicate the ones that you have, and then we're going to open them up. So by default, you have mouse movement set on them instead of joystick axis. So you're going to want to change the type to joystick axis. 9 again. And now down here at the bottom, we're going to do the triggers, the left and right triggers. Now, I have them duplicated from whatever I had before. You might have cancel or whatever the last input button is. Just duplicate whatever you have and then change the names to right trigger and left trigger respectively. And you're going to make sure it's set to joystick axis. you're going to set right trigger to 10th axis and left trigger to 9th axis. Now we're going to duplicate this again, and we're going to have right and left bumper. So name them to right and left bumper. And this is where we're actually going to need some joystick button controls. So either in the positive button or the alt positive button sections for both of them, you're just going to put, for right bumper, it's going to be joystick button 5. It has to look exactly like this. And then left bumper is going to be joystick button 4. And make sure that their type down here is set to key or mouse button. And make sure they're both of them. Next, we have the 4 buttons, so you can duplicate it once. You can name that one to A button. We're going to make sure it's still set to key or mouse button, but for A, it's going to be joystick button 0 instead. Now duplicate that 3 times and rename it for B, X, and Y, and you're going to change the joystick buttons to 1, 2, and 3. That's what all 4 of your main letter buttons should look like. Now you're going to duplicate the Y button. You're going to rename it to D-pad horizontal. It's just like in the string value that we have inside of the code. This is what has to be exactly the same. Otherwise, Unity will not recognize the input name. You're going to change D-pad vertical as well. So it's going to be D-pad horizontal and vertical. You can remove the positive button names since we don't need any of that. And now for the types, you're going to set joystick axis for both of them. And the 6th axis is what you're going to use for D-pad horizontal, which you can access just here. See this? And then the 7th axis is for D-pad vertical. And that's what the Xbox One controller uses for the D-pad. Now we're going to duplicate it again, and we're going to call this back. And then you're going to change it to key or mouse button for the type. And the axis is irrelevant whenever we're using key or mouse button. The positive button is going to be set to joystick button 6. We're going to duplicate that one more time. You're going to rename it to start and then joystick button 7. And that's all you need for this to actually start working. So I'm going to press maximize on play. I'm going to hit play and we're going to see if this works. All right, so it looks like the colors are being properly detected. So let's press the left and right bumper. Okay, they work. The back and start buttons, they're working. The triggers works really well. See how I'm slowly pressing a trigger and it's actually detecting how fast I'm pressing it. So if you go really slowly, that's actually me detecting the movement of the controller. The left and right sticks. My right stick is not quite working, but my left stick is. And for some reason, my left, up, right, and downs are not detecting properly. But we know our X, Y, A, and B's are working. So let's find out what's going on with these two. I named the D-pad and horizontal and vertical strings incorrectly. So we got to make sure it's named D-pad and D-pad. I found it. I had move HR multiplying 2 times time delta instead of one of them being VR instead. We're going to save that. We're going to refresh. We're going to press play. And now you can see both the cubes are working properly. Our D-pad buttons are working, so I can press 2 at the same time. Everything else is working just fine. And there we go. Guys, that is your basic Xbox One controller input settings in Unity being used in a practical way, all being mapped with our little fun Xbox input controller that we just built. So this sample project is available for download in the description. It's everything you see here in this video so you can quickly use it as an Xbox controller template for your games. Let me know in the comment sections if you have any questions about using Xbox controllers in Unity and I'll answer them to the best of my abilities. Now go and make something cool and I'll see you in the next video.